Hi, I'm Stephen McCarthy from the communications team at Breckland Council. We're always looking for new ways to reach you, to keep you up to date with our work here at Team Breckland. We're really excited to be sharing our new podcast with you, or what we are calling Breckcast. In this episode, we have a special guest contributor. We were joined during Armed Forces Week, 24th to 30th of June, by retired Lieutenant Colonel Rod Eldridge. He took the opportunity to speak to Team Breckland about mental health in the armed forces and veteran communities. We recorded his speech on this vitally important subject to share with you.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me and watch the Armed Forces Week so I can be part of what you're doing for veterans within Breckland. Thank you, Helen, for that introduction. My background, as you may have seen from the little flyer that went round, is I served in the military for near 27 years, mainly in a medical capacity, both medical as in general nursing and mental health, so a therapist and mental health nursing. I've served on at least 8 operational tours and some other funny things that the military get you to do from time to time. So I have a fair wealth of experience, which I'm willing to share with you. So it'll be a part of a formal presentation. So we'll go through some slides, which I think will have a lot of salient, pertinent information, which would help you being champions, or if you get the opportunity to work with veterans or meet veterans, some background information that you'll find very, very helpful. At the end of that, I did say to Helen, I'd rather have more of a sort of fireside chat. So if you've had some time to think about a question that is nagging for you, or you're concerned about, or you'd like more information, and this really is the thrust of the talk, because there's a lot of myths and misunderstanding around military service and what provision there is, particularly around mental health, which I find rather worrying, because people start developing policy or taking actions or developing attitudes around veterans which aren't often founded in evidence or reality. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk about these things, but equally, I wouldn't like to think you were leaving here without having any kind of queries or thoughts around the military that you'd like answered, not being answered. The person who gives me or asks the best question will get a prize today. And that's this little pewter fella here from 1944. So we're recently celebrating Normandy. This kind of fella, and dressed as he is, carrying his Bren gun, would have been assault in the beaches. So it's a little gift to the person who asked the best question today, which we'll award at the end. So if we could just, move on a slide. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the key issues, as I see it, surrounding mental health, because there has been a lot of interest in the mental health and psychological well-being of troops in recent years, because we have had a very busy few decades, most notably in Afghanistan and Iraq, with what's been protracted, difficult situations. But there's a lot of other conflicts we've been involved in often get forgotten about, like the Falklands, like Korea, and that can be an issue for veterans, because maybe all we think about now is the most recent combat, like, again, Iraq, Afghanistan, but we forget about the Balkans, we forget about the Falklands, and more closer to home, we forget about the effects of Northern Ireland, where we were there for many decades. Again, I'm going to talk largely about my personal experiences. I have got some evidential background. I've worked with some of my colleagues at King's College London and others. We have the Academic Centre for Defence Mental Health. So we're starting to do much more research around what happens to our guys and girls that serve. So we've got a large cohort study going on, and there's lots now being produced that really underpins and informs what we offer veterans and serving personnel. There was a criticism of a report that went into the Falklands conflict and the first Gulf War for a lack of understanding of how many veterans we have, the psychological effects and physical effects of their service, where they now live. So we couldn't track where people were. We couldn't track health trends or illnesses. So when there was a class action brought against the MOD for a failure to provide enough mental health support during the Falklands conflict and subsequently, and the first Iraq War, they actually came up with the Academic Centre for Defence Mental Health, where we now have, and it's a great website, great university with lots of information if you really want to look into that. I'm sure Helen can provide links to that kind of thing. But we are much better informed now in what we deliver and provide for our service personnel. As I've said, it's been busy decades for us, for an increasingly smaller armed forces, which is a key point. but we're asked to do much more with less. And that's not only war fighting, but that's peacekeeping, peace enforcing, and also just on the home front. If you're short of manpower for the Olympics, who do they go to? If we've got mad cow disease, who do we go to? COVID, we're running out of medics, who do we go to? Floods, who do we need a bridge built? Get the engineers, that's what they do, and they love doing it. But so there's lots more we use us for, and prisons if they go on strike, the green goddesses, I think, the fire engines, it goes on and on. So we're a ready, available workforce when the country needs us. And there are a lot of emotive issues around veterans and military personnel. What's wonderful for us who served or are serving, we get a sense there's a national pride. A lot of people are very grateful for our service and what we do. So it is a very emotive issue, but it's so lovely you guys take an interest like you are today. It helps us when we deploy or when we come home knowing that you've got our backs, and we know other armies like America and Vietnam, that certainly wasn't the case. There's a very powerful factor and a protective factor in how people cope and adjust for a military service, knowing we don't really seen as heroes. We don't want any of that. We just want to be thanked for doing a job to the best of our ability, often in difficult circumstances. So it is an emotive issue. Many of you will have relatives who have served either down the years in wars or done national service. So I know it's close to many people's hearts. Thank you. The role of the armed forces is interesting. It's changed in recent decades because the threats to this country and our wider interests have changed dramatically. So we might have been talking more about a war-fighting stance and working in coalitions to sort things out. We now talk about safety and security of our country and our dependent territories, which we have 14, which would include like the Falklands, Cyprus, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, etc. Some of the islands aren't always manned. They also talk about protecting our nation and helping it prosper. So there's an economic element now to what the armed forces do. Our armed forces have already alluded to and actually reduced significantly in size. So when you think back to the Cold War, when we maybe going to have a little spat with the Russians, we had hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany. Now, I think there's only 73,000 army troops. There's about 30,000 Royal Air Force, similar for the Navy, and you've got to add the Marines and our reserves. So where we would have been, hundreds of thousands as a body of personnel to go and do what the government with its foreign policy wishes us to do, we now have very small resources. And if you think, I don't know, if you want to round that up to maybe 140,000 people, only so many of them will actually go and fight. You need the medics, you need the people who bring the supplies, the ammunition, the meat, the rations, the medical support, but the technical support to the vehicles. So only about a third of those will actually be carrying weapons and interdicting with the enemy in firefights, etc., prosecuting any missions that we have. So we have peacekeeping, peace enforcing, we have war fighting. When I say scales, that's usually if it's small scale, short, but it can be large scale, long. So you would look at something like Afghanistan being a coalition, but that would be a large scale and it would be protracted. If you look at Bosnia, again, that was protracted, and again, was working with United Nations, very difficult rules of engagement. Rules of engagement, a very key factor in how people have difficulties in adjusting for the military service, because there's rules to how you fight, believe it or not, in the military and what you can and cannot do. But in peacekeeping, traditionally, when most of our forces have served in Northern Ireland and Germany, when you go to the likes of Bosnia and you see non-legitimate combatants being killed and injured, so we're talking about women and children being killed, ethnically cleansed, and we talk about Rwanda and other situations, that really plays with the guys and girls' heads, because that's not traditional war fighting. That's seeing ethnic cleansing. And when I treated people for PTSD in the military, we will talk about PTSD, it is usually the offences against children, particularly mass graves, and women, and the manner in which they've been killed, if people have witnessed it or heard about it, that affects them, is where I've had to intervene. So if the enemy are in in another uniform and you're fighting them for a reasonable cause, you can't get your head around it. But if you start seeing innocents being killed and injured, which we hear about all the time in our news now, you see where people are used as human shields or can be killed and injured, blaming the other side. That's the kind of thing that goes on. The threats are many now. It's not just guns and bombs and bullets. It's actually the threats of cyber, intelligence use, remote taskings, because we have a tremendous amount of technology now. Somebody told me the other day that when we went to the Falklands, we sent so many thousands of airmen, sailors and soldiers down there, Marines, on numerous ships. This one ship now has got the same firepower as everything that went down. I think it's the Dreadnought. So the technology has moved on something tremendously. We cost a lot, and I would never want to go into the human cost, but there is a significant human cost to what we do. But the budget we have to do what we do is relatively small. It's getting cut all the time. But we're all used to budget cuts, aren't we? Okay, next slide, please. One of the key points I'd like you to leave here is actually don't believe everything you read in the papers or what is the urban myth about, I don't know, classics are people who came from the Falkland Islands, returned from the Falkland Islands after the war, very intense, short battle in which they were successful, but we lost a lot of people. So in many ways, psychologically, the Falklands War was a good war. Brief. No war is good, but it was brief, it was successful. We lost far less men and women than the Argentinians. And say the mission was successful. But there was talk of people that came back on the ships, which took 2 to 3 weeks. And then there's those people who just got an aircraft and just got off at Brize Norton, blood-stained uniforms, handing in their weapons and going home. There's talk of the rates of PTSD or psychological effects on those who came back in the aeroplanes being greater than those in the ships. But there's not the case. There's no evidence to support that. But there is this notion of a kind of decompression. You've gone from high intensity conflict to being home, whereas you're on the ships, you've got time to decompress and talk things through with your mates, whatever, which I think is helpful, but it doesn't stop you having long-term psychological problems. So myth busting is really important. So I've seen literature saying the prisons are full of veterans. They're not. You're less likely to be in prison if you're a veteran. The only sort of things that are interest there, I think, sexual offences are higher in the veteran population, and violence against a person is higher. And those tend to be, and I think it's let's have a look. It was about, no, it's not. It's a slightly higher age group in the prisons that commit those kind of offences than would be expected in the civilian population. This is all from the Office of National Statistics. So roughly, we've got about 1,825 veterans in prison who have acknowledged that they at some point served in the armed forces. Some people don't like to disclose that they're in the armed forces because the prison populations are made up of mixed races and there can be hate and things taken out on them. But there are a lot of champions in the prison staff that look after folk. We've got the divorce rates again. We've seen hyperbaric sort of discussions about, or statements around the numbers of people who are divorced or not married in the military. But actually, again, you're more likely to be married and less likely to be divorced. And again, that's the ONS. Suicide rates actually are very low, consistently low. I think, again, in recent years, we've seen quite a lot in the media about, because people remember the deep cut incident near Surrey. There was a number of suicides in close proximity in a very young age group, and that was looked more at the culture there and some of the bullying maybe, but that was it was a blip, a unique situation there. It wasn't generalized across the whole of the army. Many changes were brought in as a result of that, but please be assured that suicide is very rare in the military and much lower than the general population, probably because you're employed, you're fed, you've got support readily available, and so on and so forth. Similarly, with homelessness, we hear that in London, at some point in the 90s, I think 20% of people living rough on the streets in London were veterans, but that's certainly not the case. As we look at the evidence today, the rates of homelessness are more like between 3 and 6% on the streets of London that have some association with the military. And when it comes to PTSD, I'll talk about that in greater detail later, but the rates of PTSD in serving personnel, and that's key, in serving personnel is very low. It's about 0.1%. So when you're well in service, it's when you leave rates of PTSD are higher than the general population. So the general population is around 4%. Most recent studies, again, from King's College London, are saying around 7% of veterans suffer with PTSD. Makes sense because of the nature of what we do and what we've been asking people to do in the busy decades. But interestingly, how people keep their stuff together whilst in service because they want to be promoted, they want to get on, they want to do their tours, they don't want to be, as they see it, kicked out, medically discharged for mental health difficulties. A lot of shame around that, a lot of stigma around those issues. So it's interesting how people keep their stuff together whilst in service, but when they leave, the wheels come off. Okay, next slide, please. So just some snapshots of what we're getting in the papers. So please, if you leave here with one thing, it's just question what you're reading, the sources, what the motives are for making those statements. Usually papers is to sell papers. But if you want to do veterans and serving personnel a real favour, is do talk about what you know that's truthful, that's backed up with evidence. Thank you. So what we're saying is there is no toxic legacy from military service. Most people will serve in the military, thoroughly enjoy it, get a lot out of it. They'll learn life-enhancing skills. They'll come back to the civilian workplace and have often an attitude about how to dress, timings, how to behave, which actually complement any workplace. So again, we've heard words like tsunami. There's this bow wave of people going to come to the mental health services with PTSD. It's not the case. And again, the majority do well. Where we do have vulnerable issues around people who leave early, that's where, again, if you are meeting veterans, if you have that opportunity, if you find out somebody served for less than 3 years, what we call an early service leaver, they've left usually because they haven't fitted in for some reason. That could be medical, could be administrative, could be something they didn't disclose on entry that suddenly come to light. I know, color blindness, asthma, something like that. But often it's about temperament, it's about immaturity, where people can't suborn their own needs for the greater good and they become very selfish, they don't fit in, because the military is very much about teams and working together and not looking at yourself, but looking at the wider picture. So my job was mainly looking at people like that and saying, look, you're not mentally ill. There's no real reason to offer any particular treatment, but you've made a wrong career choice, a bit square peg, round hole. So best you leave before, you do something that's regrettable or the army struggle with you, and give it a couple of years and reapply. And that's what we do. So it's called service is no longer required. Your temperament is unsuited for military service at this time. Mention PTSD. The biggest thing I saw when I worked in the Department of Community Mental Health, like your community mental health teams, we have 15 in the armed forces scattered around the UK. The main thing I saw was depression, anxiety, or acute stress reaction. So the bulk of what we see is the common mental health disorders that we all present with. Depression is the common cold of psychiatry. So just see it that way. So again, it's not all PTSD. And what I would say, there's an absolute raft of support in the military. It's better now than it ever was. You've got to admit back, and agree with what happened in the Falklands, our understanding of the psychological consequences of warfare weren't truly understood. It was very Darwinian, it was very basic. And the onus was very much on the individual to come forward. But again, in a culture, often hyper-masculinity, there's that resistance to come forward because of stigma. It was tricky. But there's so many different ways to get support now that doesn't affect your career. And those it would affect their career is very few. But we'll go into that in a minute. So thank you. Does anybody know, I asked Helen, what defines a veteran in the UK? I'll get some toys out in a minute, but how long do you think somebody has to have served to be a veteran? Don't help me, Helen. No. Yeah, well, you become a veteran as soon as you leave, so that would be definitely one of the criteria. But in terms of length of service or operational service, because it differs in different countries and obviously here, different people understanding, how long do you think you would have had to have served to be recognised in this country as a veteran? Sorry? 1 day, yeah. So I work with folk in Holland. Unless you've served on an operational tour, you're not a veteran. Or some will say you've got at least been in a year. But in this country, so you could have joined as a recruit, gone into recruit training, slept one night in your bed, got up in the morning and said, you know what, I really didn't sleep well, I'm missing my mother, I want to go home. You can go home. But you then get, this day and age, you'll get that's my driving license. What have you done with my veterans card, Helen? You can get a veterans card now. That person will get 10% off nearly everything. And it's a way to explain or tell people you've served. So actually, again, if you like to meet with veterans, you wanted proof, most people now will have applied for and got a veterans card. Most people identify a veteran these days by wearing, these are mine, by the way, if you know what but by a row of medals, a colourful tie, and usually have a blazer badge on and a beret. But you'll only ever really see them in November, on the 11th of the 11th. So, and rather disingenuously, most people are calling them kind of bombs, boring old men in blazers who talk about war stories. But that is the only time they'll often wear, if they're going to recognise and identify with being a veteran, that's the only time you'll see them wearing those things. They say, hey, I served this, so one day I will. And for them, it's very poignant. They often think about those they've lost, those who've died since events. It's just a very poignant moment. I think it's great how our nation remembers that. Sorry, we didn't finish that one. So this is key, the number of veterans. When I left the Army in 2012, there was over 5.5, maybe nearly 6 million veterans. So just 12 years on, we're now looking at, in this country, Wales and England is probably 1.8 million. You've got to add Scotland and Ireland. There's about 2.2 million veterans. So there's been a significant reduction. And again, we need to think about that. That's because World War II, our veterans are passing away from that, but also national service. We had national service, but that might be coming back. Probably not. Anyway, that's why we have so few veterans. And that population, as fewer and fewer people are now recruited into the armed forces, will get smaller and smaller and smaller. Around 14,000-ish circa leave every year. That's normal sort of drifting out, and then we're recruiting. Only 200 people across all the services are discharged on mental health grounds. So we've come to a decision, us in the mental health worlds, in our department's community mental health with a psychiatrist, that the person's mental health condition cannot be treated in a reasonable time, and that to continue in service is likely to exacerbate that problem, and they're not really going to fit in and manage after that. So we will seek their discharge, ordinarily with their permission. There's very few that would say, no, don't discharge me. People are offered 6 months to a year after being discharged to continue treatment within the department they were last seen, should they wish it. But most people live elsewhere and it's not actually logistically convenient, but there we are. Help seeking trends. So that again is a lot to do with stigma. People will have ideas about you not understanding them. If you've never served, you don't understand me. Again, it's back to stigma. So I won't really expand on that anymore. Thank you. Things that make people at risk from mental health difficulties in the military are those from the enlisted ranks. So these are your non-commissioned officers. There's more of them. They come with some very colourful backgrounds. I've done the assessments on these folks. When you look at the broken homes they've come from, the abuse that's gone on, the truancy, the failure academically, the low-level criminal involvement. So it's a bit where Rishi Sunak is going, is actually some people who come from that neck of the woods actually can, in a very structured environment where you've got clear boundaries of where to be, what to wear, what to do, and there are repercussions if you don't play ball. But they are the folk that we generally have difficulties with. Reservists can be an issue because they're usually one or two people that are attached to a unit, a regular unit that's been established for years. They've got long-standing relationships and connections. A reservist may not know them at all, and they're given a hard time. This is the way it is. But I'm not saying it's right, but they struggle. Often they're used in a role that they're not trained in, and they don't feel part of the family or the fabric of the unit, which is, again, a very protective factor. Some people are unhappy in their service. They don't want to go on a deployment because they've got pressing issues on the social front, but you've got to go with your unit. That's why you joined up. So that can be. Some people who are left at home because they're downgraded medically really struggle because they want to be part of the unit deploying. They want to get the medal, and there's a lot of finance attached to being deployed now with various incentives, operational service pay, medals, if you like, that sort of thing, which I do, don't I, Helen? Yeah. There's a key one is wounded. If you know somebody's been wounded, there's a higher index of suspicion of people having mental health difficulties following a deployment. There's issues around people surviving when others have been killed or injured, and that's around survivor guilt, feeling maybe they're responsible or they should have been there, they should have done that, which is a big part of my role in therapy, is looking at their often overestimated responsibility for their involvement in it. And I look at all the other factors that come in and get them to broaden their perspective of the events that have happened, to lessen the load on their shoulders about what they believe that they're responsible for. So you get people who've swapped duties from, I don't know, if somebody's been on an observation post all night and they're on driving duty the following day, somebody says, well, I'll swap over, because you get some kit, but that person then gets killed in an IED strike, which has happened. I've treated people for that. And a guy feels, well, if I hadn't swapped, he wouldn't be dead, but all that kind of thing. So it's a key thing. We've talked about roles and types of operation. Very key. If people aren't using the role they're trained for and employed for, which can happen in the military a lot, people struggle. I don't know. So you think you're an infantryman, you're a radio operator driver, but then you've got to actually use a machine gun because actually Taliban are firing at you. It's like, oh, well, I didn't join for this. Well, you can't do that. You're a soldier first. You've got to do what you've got to do. So exposure to atrocities and abuse speak for themselves. And I've talked about legitimate and non-legitimate. If the nature of those things are personal, so if people are being tortured, if you're physically present, so this isn't sniping somebody from 300-400 meters away, where you can see people in your scope and you're doing what has to be done. But if you're right close to somebody and they're torturing you, they're injuring you, or you're involved in that, or you witness what's happened, no problem. You won't get the prize. There's a connection there, a quality about the experience that is more likely to cause problems for people. Because how can one human being who I can see eye to eye, so it's a bit like bayoneting people, which happened in the first Gulf War when bayonets were fixed and people were killed that way. The people doing that did struggle with the Scottish Regiment, I believe. But so there is a bit about proximity and eyes in terms of these things. Again, massive. If you don't agree with the government and where it's sending you what you're doing, it's going to be at odds with you. And and there's a second Gulf War I went to where we had a couple of people who were in the reserves who never thought it would come to this. I never thought I'd have to shoot somebody, and they just put their hands up saying, I want to go home. I can't do this. I can't do it. And they were sent home, never to put the uniform on again. Technically a conscientious objective, but anyway. Stigma and avoidance. Biggest thing in men particularly is avoidance. We just don't accept that we're suffering emotionally. We're not psychologically literate or mental health literate. We don't know how to recognize symptoms or talk to people about symptoms. So an avoidance of talking about anything, I'm a man, I'm okay, is big. Next slide, please. These all speak for themselves. The biggest bond is the blokes in the trench will fight for each other, not for the Queen or now the King. They will fight for their mate in the trench. Usually they've been to school with, they're from the same area. They've exchanged or experienced a lot of adversity together, and that has just made them so strong. They will fight for their unit, their section, their platoon, whatever. That I'd almost call it love. That depth of camaraderie is such a powerful protective factor. We mentioned the public support. These guys and girls are generally very healthy and fit. That's part of what we do. We do really hard, arduous, realistic training, so kind of stress inoculation. So we train hard for what's going to happen. Ideally, we'd fight easy. So if we train hard, do what almost happens instinctively regarding weapons and doing what we do, it becomes very easy to us. There's a lot of history in these regiments. There's been a lot of amalgamations, a lot of changes which have gone down very hard with people. But there's a lot of pride in people's families have served in particular regiments. We recruit a lot from the northeast, northwest. The regiments from there have great histories, and the guys have had families probably served in there. So it's important to them. You will hear black and gallows humor. We are terrible. Within minutes of something dreadful happening, somebody will break the ice with an absolutely howling comment that you think, wow, that's shocking. But somehow we do it, and it's kind of a defense mechanism. It's a way of coping with horror in a way that makes it more palatable in that setting. I don't particularly promote it. I wouldn't suggest we should, but don't be surprised when you're working with folk if they come out with stuff. You go, whoa, hold on, that's not good. But for them, it's part of the culture, as are abbreviations. Lots of abbreviations. We love them. But actually, we've got a good workforce because they're employed. It's a volunteer army or armed forces. We don't make people, we don't, at the moment anyway, we don't make people join forces. So it's a volunteer armed forces. They're employed usually in skilled professions. They're housed or accommodated. They're fed, well clothed, well paid, and it's a good pension when you've served a reasonable time in the armed forces. Next week. Key points for me about PTSD. So I'm going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in a little bit more detail in a minute, but please think about growth. From bad things, good things happen. We appraise the world differently from adversity. Where I've nearly died or seen others die, my life values will change. My personal values, my beliefs and values about others and the world I live in, whether it's safe, whether I'm more vulnerable. But actually, most people I know, when PTSD has taken its course and the mind has taken its time to process what's happened, you'll find people have got a more adaptive and healthy way of looking at things on the whole. Moral injury, you probably would have heard of. I was in help with the COVID issue at the Nightingale in London. The nurses and medical staff there had a lot of moral injury issues because under the Nursing Midwifery Council and the GMC, we have standards of care that we should deliver. But when we had to look after, I think it was 163 intensive care patients in London, the standard of care we could deliver in PPE and all that was way lower than what we'd expect. So those people were coming off shift in tears and really unhappy that they couldn't deliver the care that they wanted to their standards. And it's the same for the military. If I'm, 18 stone, strapping muscles, tattoos, I'm majorly proficient on all my weapons, and I'm on a United Nations Protection Force. Rules of engagement preclude me from shooting unless my life is directly threatened. But you witness other people being killed or injured, again, children, women. But you are not allowed to do anything about that. That's a moral injury, because how can I, as a man, and then with this ability, and I'm in the armed forces, I'm here to do a job, but I can't because the rules of engagement make me piggy in the middle. That plays with the guys' heads. I mentioned fabrication. There's a commissioner in the police who wore the Falklands medals, didn't he? He's not entitled to, and rightly he's resigned and kicked out. I'm afraid there are a lot of people in the military. I mean, the SAS is the biggest regiment in the armed forces. Everyone I know has served in the SAS. If you give me 2 or 3 pints, I was in the SAS. But so you do understand that people will embellish their stories and whatever else. So you might get somebody wearing the likes of this, the Victoria Cross, which is our highest award for valor. And that's a Hancock's one. Hancock's make the actual Victoria Crosses. You want to look at it after, you're welcome. But they can range from 200,000 to £1 million to buy one of those. It's not a genuine one, obviously. Otherwise, but I have seen lots of images of people wearing medals that just don't add up. They've got 4 gallantry awards and whatever else, just don't add up. And I don't know what that's about. I think it's some personality deficit, or they're compensating for something. But I see SAS berries and badges. It's just terrible. And the guys don't like it. They really, because you are stealing their valor. If they've won those medals, if they've been in those places, they are what they are. If you're feigning it, how dare you? How very dare you? I mean, I think it's an American term, stolen valor, but they're big on it. I think you get in America, you get arrested and imprisoned. In this country, you just get a lot of rubbish. Is on arse.com or something? You get, we call it anyway, they call them Walter Mitty's, don't they? And they found out and they're given a lot of grief, but they don't go to prison. Compensation can be a big issue. Again, if you're meeting these folk, some of them will get war pensions before 2005. So if you've got a disability, if you lost your arm, blind in one eye, got a depression, you might get a 40% award. You will get a lump sum of, say, I don't know, for argument's sake, £100,000 tax-free, and you'll get £10,000 a year for the rest of your life, and you probably attract PIP, and you've got free travel on the London tubes and buses, I think, something like that. So that's war pension. Armed forces is a slightly different one. If I lost my finger in a tank door under Armed Forces Pension Scheme, I could carry on serving. I'd probably get £2,000 for my finger, and that's it. Obviously, if I have more injuries and they accumulate, I can get a higher reward, again, tax-free. But they are compensated for injuries, psychological and physical, or a combination thereof, because they often go hand in hand. Biggest thing you'll find is a lot of people, you will have those ones with a sense of entitlement that I did my bit in the military. It might be one day, it might be 20 years, but they've got a sense that somehow I'm more important and I deserve more. So you get the issue around the immigrants and the boats coming in. I see it all the time. People get very animated about, I've served my country, I've done my bit, but I can't get a house, or I can't get this, I can't get that. So you get that side. But the main thing around the challenge is, if you've got a mental health difficulty, they'll often say, you don't understand me, you've not served, you've not been there, how can you understand my issues? I always say, try and get beyond that, be clever, be creative, get beyond that, because how a PTSD presents is the same as PTSD in Civvy Street. If you like, been in RTA, been in a violent assault, rape, whatever, it's the same qualities, it's just a different context. So you can still help them. So I think you just got to stick with it. However, often NHS services in the early days, things are much better now, which we'll talk about in a minute. NHS services would reject seeing veterans. They say, well, that's for the army or the armed forces to deal with. We've got no understanding. We've got no skills of understanding that sensitive military culture. That's all changed now. It's much better, which I'm really pleased to say. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time and you asking questions. So the list speaks for itself, but it's not a surprise to anyone who gets PTSD. They've had trauma before in their lives. So events in the military can make people feel out of control, horrified, vulnerable. So it just resonates with what's happened in the past. It can open wounds from the past. Conduct disorder, histories of abuse. So the dose rate makes sense. If you've been traumatized once, but then it repeatedly happens, it has an accumulative effect. So the more, if you're on a protracted operation, you're witnessing a lot of things, it's very hard to process because you're now in the next event and the next event. So there's that. Types of trauma, as I said earlier, if it's personal, if somebody's injuring you, we have a higher index of suspicion. If it's a man-made disaster like an airplane crash or a bridge falling, something like that, that's fine. If it's an act of God, so a flood and all that, there's less likelihood of having PTSD. So it's about the human contact is key. Sorry, Nick. Again, we'll whistle through that. But somebody has to have been exposed to an event where they feel that their life or others is directly threatened, and they believe they're going to die. They're disgusted. They're horrified. They feel helpless and vulnerable. And there's other contexts around that. And the diagnostic criteria is set by the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychiatry, which is American Association. Then you've got the International Classification of Diseases, have a stricter criteria. But there are set symptoms you have to get matched to get labeled as PTSD. I'm only saying this from an interest point of view because I've already said PTSD is actually relatively rare in the military. It's more prominent in the veteran population. Next slide, please. The main thing you'll see with people is the re-experiencing. People talk about nightmares. They don't get very good night's sleep because they're visited by those events. They're very vivid. They're very real. And you get those who have flashbacks. So I could now, smell something, hear something, get a taste in my mouth that would suddenly trip me back to an event in Afghanistan, for example. And I'd almost go there like it's happening again. I'd start to look very worried. And it might last 2 seconds. It might last 2 minutes. We equip people with the skills to cut that, learn when they happen, get better endings, and they can, and with nightmares, have somewhere you can touch when you wake up, touch somewhere, or look at 5 things in the room that remind you that you're home, you're safe. And that's what, or it could be colors, it could be things you touch to ground you. Avoidance is the biggest thing. Intrusive images are thoughts that come into your mind about events and images that come into your mind out of your control. is a key indicator in PTSD. Being hyper-aroused, vigilant for risk. You'll see soldiers often say they'll go into a room, they'll sit where they can see the door so they can get out. And they're often scanning for where the next threat or danger is because their flight or fright mechanism is constantly activated, which is tiring, chronically tiring. They take more risks. They drive fast. More soldiers die in RTAs and motorbike accidents, particularly our special forces, because they just take more risks. They spend their money unwisely. Sexual relations are, so we say, more promiscuous. So they take more risks. PTSD, in terms of timings, usually you have post-traumatic symptoms for about 4 to 6 weeks after an event. That is normal because your brain is making sense of what's happened. It's processing it. So that would be normal for it to settle, and that's the usual direction of travel. But you can have delayed onset, so 6 months after, and you can have complex, again, which is more traumas in different types. So earlier stages of your life, in service, or even after service. Next slide, please. Lots of ways to treat it. What we do initially is leave it alone, just see if it'll sort itself out by itself. So what they call active monitoring or waiting. The direction of treatment is usually around antidepressants because there's a depressive component, an anxious component to PTSD, but mainly talking therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Fancy words for basically different ways of appraising what you've experienced, different ways of looking at it, and actually working cleverly with that person to look at it again and again, to repeatedly look at it, to habituate, to desensitize to what it is that's triggering the difficulty. Next, please. Again, conscious of time, but I've said there's there's 15 departments I would have been working in around the place. We have deployed field mental health teams. People are given loads of briefs prior to the operation, during the operation, after the operation. The selection process actually is very arduous and it makes people more resilient when it comes to deployment. The units have their own welfare chain. They have their own medical officer. Outside, in the military, even if we had somebody in crisis, we had access to a bed within 24 hours so it was an independent service provider, which was an NHS provider. We had access to a bed to admit somebody within 4 hours from the military if we needed. I mentioned people can have ongoing care after they've left. Sorry, next slide, please. These I've talked about, but it's the biggest thing is actually people won't come forward. And I would say it's they're very self-sufficient. They really worry about how it's going to affect their careers and their promotions are the main reasons. The rest speak for themselves. Sorry, next slide, please. There is a wealth of provision out there. We see the centre as being the NHS with what's called OP Courage. You get the intensive treatment service, TILS. TIL standing for Transition Intervention Liaison Service. Yeah. Complex treatment service and high intensity service. So actually anyone that's got a service attributable mental health condition can access the NHS through Op Courage, should have local teams. Within a week they'll get an assessment and they'll titrate this response depending on the nature of the conditions. We then work with established charities and providers at different levels of stepped care, if you can get your head around it, and then there's lots of other charities. What I would say, there's thousands out there. There's about 2,000 charities. How you navigate that if you're in distress and you need that help, I think it'd be overwhelming for folks. So you guys, if you are intervening with veterans, all you need to know is that these exist and you need to direct them depending on their need into those services. You don't have to do anything, but these are pretty expert now. I'd say the NHS is much, much better. Things have improved significantly. They are culturally aware of the needs of veterans. So, okay, and next slide, please. So getting to the end, we just need to think about what we read and what we believe. PTSD clearly exists and it's prominent in our veterans, but common mental health disorders are very much the issue. Alcohol abuse isn't quite the issue it once was. Most recover without treatment. Please understand that distress is a normal part of the human experience. So we expect, especially in the military, to see some dreadful things, but it's a normal response to such events. many people think they grow up as a result of being in the military. Their life values change, so it can enhance their lives. And I'm not saying for everyone, there are those that are affected, obviously, but do think of it actually can be a positive experience. And there is a wealth of support out there.
That was our latest episode of Breckcast. If you'd like to find out more about the work of Breckland Council, follow the link to our website on your podcast host. I've been Stephen McCarthy from Breckland's communications team. Thank you for joining us at Breckcast. Stay tuned for future episodes here and across our social media channels. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share.